Is it wrong to steal to feed your family? Is there such a thing as a good lie? Questions like these are the domain of ethics, the branch of philosophy that studies morality, or right and wrong behavior. But before we can parse questions like these, we need to go deeper into metaethics, which studies the very foundations of morality itself. Metaethics asks questions as basic as what is morality? What's its nature? Like, is it an objective thing out there in the world waiting to be known?
I know this might seem a little provocative statement at first, but hear me out. Like many great explanations, this too starts with two axes, so let us draw them here. The x-axis denotes time, but the y-axis is a trickier thing indeed. Let's look into it, shall we? You are conscious, that is, you have a subjective experience. But states of consciousness are infinite in kind. I feel safe to say that this is because every moment of consciousness is an emergent phenomenon from underlying neurological functioning. And, well, the combinatorics of how any individual's neural pathways could be structured and which specific neurons within that structure are firing action potentials at any given time might as well be said to be infinite. Only mathematicians would flinch at that statement. How does this subjective experience arise though? That I don't know, but it is not the focus of this video. Now comes my big conjecture. I assert that every momentary subjective experience, despite their qualitative diversity, can be mapped, or projected if you will, onto a single value dimension, and that this momentary value is as real and true as can be, even though we cannot measure it in an objective way, and may never be able to do so. So, let's now set that value of subjective experience to be our y-axis. The value of 0 is a special one. It is quantitatively speaking equivalent to not having an experience at all. Most of the universe is like this. It would seem that only once you get above the complexity of a fish brain can you expect a being to possess a subjective experience worth moral consideration. How this applies to the future of artificial intelligence, that is without a doubt far beyond my expertise. Now, the positive subjective experience could be described with words like pleasant, content, ecstatic, carefree, immersive, enjoyable, and so on. The word happiness is particularly interesting, and it usually carries the notion of having a net positive subjective experience in a longer time frame, but let's not get ahead of ourselves with time quite yet. The time for time is nigh. On the other hand, I find the negative subjective experience to be pretty thoroughly described as suffering, some manifestations being worrying, frustration, pain, sadness, and hopelessness, to name a few. The severity of a positive or a negative subjective experience is of course indicated by the distance from the x-axis, for example on the positive side moving from content to happy to euphoric, and on the negative side moving from feeling a little down and bored to proper sadness and then to major depressive mood or agony. Now, let's think of a subjective experience, for example that of a human being, as a function of time. Because the subjective experience is an emergent phenomenon of brain functioning that is always different from one moment to the next, therefore the subjective experience differs also as a function of time, at least a little. We can draw a graph of the subjective experience as a function of time. Here I'm using the unrealistic sine wave for simplicity's sake. The area between the graph and the x-axis is what's called an integral. The area below the x-axis is subtracted from the area above it. In this context, it works as kind of a score. It tracks how much value of subjective experience has accumulated during a specific time interval. Okay, so back to moral realism, aka objective morality. Let's say you're in a restaurant and you're given a choice to pick from food A or food B. You know that you're going to enjoy food A more than you would enjoy food B. Let's also suppose that the foods are equally healthy, that they're the same price, and that their production has been similarly ethical and so on, so that the only difference is in how much you're going to enjoy the experience of eating your food. What I'm saying is that picking food A is objectively the right choice, because as you can see from the illustration, You're increasing your subjective experience value integral, or SEVI in short, without it affecting anything outside this graph. At this point, I'm going to note that what I've laid down here is what I would consider a rather rigorous intellectual grounds for utilitarianism, my definition for utility being the sum of all subjective experience value integrals that have existed, and more importantly, as choices are concerned, those that will exist. So therefore, ideally, to be maximally ethical, one ought to weigh all possible choices based on their consequences on world SEVI. How that end might be met is a cause for pause. Of course, usually any decision tends to affect a lot of things downstream. The world, our lives, and our brains are in a mathematical sense chaotic like that. But it would be one of the most arrogant things I've heard to say that just because you don't know the right answer, therefore one cannot exist. Even though nobody can compute every possible outcome in complicated real-life decisions, it doesn't mean that some choices cannot be better than others. I have an analogy. Some of you might know the board game Go. It has been heralded as one of the most complex and elegant games out there. It has far more possible sets of moves than chess, for example. It was only recently that Google's AI called AlphaGo defeated the human champion of the game, whereas IBM's Deep Blue beat the world champion of chess at that time, Garry Kasparov, already in 1997, the year I was born. Just because AlphaGo, like any human player for that matter, couldn't calculate all the possible games downstream of any one move, it doesn't mean that some moves aren't better than others. Otherwise, it would only be a game of luck, which Go most certainly is not. Neither is life. Intuition is something that can be trained, and intuition is exactly what drives our decision making when all the possible outcomes become too much to handle, or if the choice we are presented with isn't important enough to warrant thorough thinking. So utilize, nurture, and guide your intuition with ever more accurately pragmatic models of the world and humanity. I would now like to guide your intuition into subscribing and sharing if forgivable, as I will be expanding on this video with what may very well become a long series, especially focusing on game theory in the context of ethics. There's also a playlist of videos I found on YouTube dancing around the themes I've explored here in the description. There's plenty of interesting stuff there. Finally, I'd like to partially dedicate this video to Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, both of whom I greatly admire as thinkers. Also, what the hell is this cop-out of a video, quite gesagt? It's beautiful and all, but first you say you're nihilists and then go on to praise the subjective experience as something of value and therefore meaning. Can't you see the inherent contradiction there? Anyway, see you next time, and to every single one of you who happened to stumble upon this video, may your SEVI be grand.